A flight attendant humiliated a set of black triplets, slapping one so hard he burst into tears, but moments later, their father, a powerful black CEO, made him regret ever raising a hand. He mocked the triplets from the moment they boarded, slapping one so hard the cabin froze. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The juice bottle hit the boy's lap with a wet thud. Kamari froze as the cold liquid soaked through his green hoodie, the apple scent sharp in the air. The sealed plastic bottle rolled off his thigh and landed with a soft bounce on the plush first-class carpet, leaving behind a spreading stain. Across the aisle, passengers glanced up, eyes flicking between the embarrassed teen and the tall, unsmiling flight attendant now towering over him. "Oops," said Vance Heller, his voice flat but laced with something unspoken, something mean. "Must have slipped." He didn't reach down to pick up the bottle. He didn't offer a napkin. He just stood there, hands on hips, lips curled into the faintest smirk, like he was enjoying the moment. Elijah, seated beside his brother, straightened in his seat. His eyes narrowed. "Was that really necessary?" he asked calmly, though his tone was strained. He was trying, like they all were, to stay composed. That was how they'd been raised. Vance's practiced smile didn't budge. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, emphasizing the last word in a way that made it feel like an accusation. His gaze swept over the three boys seated in the row, Elijah, Kamari, and Terrell, all wearing matching dark green hoodies with the Gravon Aerospace logo stitched neatly on the chest. Their mother had sewn those hoodies herself before she passed. Kamari wiped at the juice with the edge of his sleeve, cheeks burning. Terrell leaned forward to help him, silently offering a napkin he'd taken earlier with his own drink. Their laughter from earlier, when they'd been snapping selfies and playfully arguing over window seats, was now gone, replaced by thick tension that pressed down on their row like cabin pressure. The flight attendant didn't move. He lingered. Elijah's jaw tightened. "He just asked for juice," he said, pointing discreetly to the man in 1C who was sipping his own with no issue. "You told us water only." Vance's smile vanished. "Are you trying to start something?" he said, voice lower now, body leaning just slightly into their space. The threat wasn't loud, but it was clear. Terrell stiffened in his seat. He reached across and squeezed Kamari's wrist gently, as if to keep him grounded. Reuben's words echoed in his head. Always stay calm. Always protect each other. Always let the truth show itself. But right now, the truth was sitting right in front of them, and it had a name tag that read V. Heller. Vance finally stepped back. "If there's anything else you need, flag me properly," he said with a clipped tone, then turned on his heel and walked briskly toward the galley, his shoes clicking with measured precision. But he didn't go far. Just a few steps past curtain line, he paused and glanced over his shoulder just long enough to confirm they were watching him. He didn't like them. That much was obvious. Kamari sank deeper into his seat, still clutching his now damp hoodie. He didn't cry. He just looked out the window, pretending the clouds below held more comfort than the people inside this cabin. Terrell leaned in and whispered something only he could hear. Kamari nodded faintly. Back at the terminal, everything had felt lighter. Their father, Reuben Thatch, had seen them off at the security gate with a proud grin and one last reminder to enjoy each other. Elijah had teased Terrell for double-knotting his sneakers like a kid. Kamari had been sketching space shuttles in his notebook while humming a melody their mother used to sing. Gate 42B had felt like the starting line of a rare, well-earned joy. But somewhere between boarding and takeoff, that joy had soured. Vance Heller had clocked them the moment they entered the jet bridge. His eyes had scanned the passenger manifest as if it personally offended him. 3 of them, he had muttered while checking the names. First class. Of course, no one had heard him, at least no one who would challenge him. That was the problem. Inside the plane, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft leveled into cruising altitude. Kamari wiped the last of the juice from his lap, then carefully pulled out his sketch pad again. The pages were still dry. On the paper was a half-finished drawing of a sleek orbital craft, the graven emblem stamped across the wing. "You okay?" Elijah asked softly. "Yeah," Kamari said. His voice was thin but steady. Terrell looked over. "He did that on purpose." Elijah nodded slowly. "I know. But we don't give him what he wants." Kamari stared at his drawing, the outlines now a little shaky from where his hands trembled. "He smiled," he said quietly. right before he dropped it. He smiled. The three brothers sat in silence, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Around them, other passengers resumed their routines, reading, watching movies, scrolling phones, most unaware of the undercurrent threading its way through row 2. But one man did notice. Curtis Jail, seated 2 rows behind, had watched the entire thing unfold. He leaned back in his seat, thoughtful, frowning, and made a mental note of the attendant's name. Up in the front galley, Vance Heller poured himself a glass of sparkling water. His hands were steady. He took a sip, adjusted his tie, and exhaled. He thought about the boys in 2A, 2B, and 2C. He thought about how familiar this felt, how many times he'd had to remind passengers like them of the rules, or make the rules up if necessary. They never push back, he thought. They know better. But what Vance didn't know, what he hadn't yet realized, was that these 3 boys weren't traveling alone, that the name Thatch on the manifest wasn't just another boarding pass, that their father had power far beyond his suit and smile, and that every moment of cruelty was already beginning to echo beyond the cabin walls. He would realize it soon enough. 3 of them, he had muttered to himself while checking the seating chart. First class. Of course, the bottle of juice struck with a heavy, wet smack. Kamari jerked in surprise as the cold liquid seeped into the fabric of his hoodie, darkening the green cotton in an uneven splash across his chest and lap. His hands lifted instinctively, but it was too late. Drops clung to his fingers. The bottle rolled off his thigh and landed between his feet with a hollow thud. "Oh no," Vance Heller said flatly, a tight-lipped smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "Must have slipped." For a moment, the air inside the first-class cabin held perfectly still. No one moved. The overhead lights cast a muted glow over the rows of plush cream-colored seats, and the only sound was the soft hum of the engines pushing the aircraft through a sea of clouds. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he looked from Kamari to the flight attendant. Terrell's hand hovered over the armrest, frozen mid-reach toward his brother. Kamari blinked down at his soaked hoodie, confusion mingling with shame. "It's okay," he murmured, voice barely audible, though it clearly wasn't. Reuben Thatch's youngest son tried to brush it off, but the stickiness had already set in, clinging to his skin beneath the damp fabric. His sketchpad, tucked beside him moments before, now bore a faint wet ring on its corner from a stray drop. He reached for it slowly, as if afraid of drawing more attention. Elijah, the eldest by 5 minutes and always the protector, leaned forward. His voice was steady but firm. "Sir, was that necessary?" Vance didn't answer right away. He bent down, picked up the bottle with an exaggerated gesture, and held it aloft between his thumb and forefinger like something foul. "What are you implying?" he asked, his tone sharp, his eyes cold. "I'm not implying anything," Elijah said evenly, "but you could have handed it to him." "I told him it was water only," Vance snapped, stepping closer. "The bar's not open to everyone whenever they feel like it." Terrell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his foot brushing Kamari's beneath the shared row. "But the man in 1C just got juice, sir," he said quietly. "I saw you hand it to him." Vance leaned in, lowering his voice to a dangerous hush. "Are you trying to start something?" His breath smelled faintly of mint, but the look in his eye was bitter. "Because I suggest you sit there and mind your manners." The triplets said nothing. Other passengers were beginning to take notice. A man across the aisle paused mid-page in his novel. A middle-aged executive glanced up from his tablet. Their gazes flicked between the boys and the flight attendant, uncertain. No one spoke up. No one interfered. Elijah sat back slowly, but his eyes didn't leave Vance's face. Terrell exhaled softly, tension still in his shoulders. Kamari turned his face toward the window, trying to hide the blooming red in his cheeks. Vance remained standing over them, arms crossed. "If I see another disruption from this row," he said lowly, "I'll report it to the captain. Don't test me." With that, he turned on his heel and stalked toward the galley. The hum of conversation resumed, but quieter now, strained. Terrell leaned over and whispered, "Did we do something wrong?" "No," Elijah answered, "but he wants to make us feel like we did." Kamari sniffled quietly and pulled the damp hoodie away from his skin. The moment lingered in his mind, the way the bottle had fallen, the deliberate aim, the smirk. That wasn't an accident. He was sure of it. Elijah pulled out his phone and checked the screen, not recording yet, but his thumb hovered near the button. The edge in Vance's tone, the false smile, the silent glances from the other passengers, it was all becoming a pattern. Tyrell looked around nervously. "We should call Dad." "No," Elijah replied. "Not yet. We don't need to worry him unless—" He stopped mid-sentence as he caught Vance glaring at them from the galley entrance, eyes shadowed beneath the dim lighting, arms once again folded in that rigid stance. There was no mistaking it now. Vance wasn't just annoyed. He was watching, waiting. Elijah lowered his phone. The boys sat in silence for a long moment. Outside the window, the clouds looked peaceful, soft, untroubled, the way the trip was supposed to be. But inside that row, 2A, 2B, and 2C, the storm had already started. They didn't say another word for the next hour, not because they were afraid of speaking, but because they knew now that every move they made would be watched, every word weighed and twisted if needed. The air was thinner here, not just because of altitude, but because of pressure. And the tension had taken root. Vance Heller's footsteps were quiet but deliberate as he made his way down the aisle, a metal glint from the beverage cart catching the low cabin lights. The cabin hummed softly with the sound of engines, and overhead reading lights cast a warm glow over first class. The passengers were calm, the mood relaxed, until Vance stopped at row 2 and narrowed his eyes. He stood over the boys like a shadow stretching across their row. Elijah was flipping through Kamari's sketchpad, chuckling at a cartoon panel his younger brother had drawn. Tyrell sat beside them, hoodie still up, arms crossed loosely as he leaned against the window. They weren't loud, just laughing, whispering, and being teenage brothers on a long flight. "Take it off," Vance snapped suddenly. Tyrell looked up, caught off guard. "Sir?" "The hoodie." "Off. Now. It's airline policy." Security check. Elijah furrowed his brow. "Is that a real policy?" Everyone else— "I wasn't talking to you," Vance interrupted sharply, his voice lowering, gaining an edge. "I said remove it." "Don't make this difficult." Tyrell hesitated, his fingers instinctively brushing the hem of his dark green hoodie, the embroidered Graven Aerospace logo barely visible in the low lighting. He glanced around. Other passengers wore jackets, scarves, and, yes, hoodies. None were being told to remove them. "It's just a hoodie, sir." Everyone else has theirs on. That's when Vance moved. In one swift motion, he reached down, grabbed Tyrell's forearm, and yanked. The boy jerked forward in his seat, startled. His headphones slipped off one ear. Elijah stood immediately, the movement fast and full of instinct. His chair creaked under the pressure. "Let go of him," Elijah shouted, his chest rising with sudden breath. He stepped between Vance and Tyrell, hand out. Vance's face twisted, his mask of professionalism cracking. With his free hand, he shoved Elijah back hard into the seat across the aisle. Elijah stumbled but didn't fall, gripping the armrest to steady himself. Passengers looked up now, eyebrows raised, mouths slightly open. "Sit down before I report all three of you for disorderly conduct," Vance barked, breath fast, fingers still clenched at his side like fists waiting to fly. Tyrell's heart was pounding. Kamari had gone silent, clutching his sketchpad to his chest like a shield. His pencil had dropped to the floor. The laughter from earlier was gone, sucked out of the air like cabin pressure lost mid-flight. The moment froze, and then it shattered. Without warning, Vance swung his hand, sharp, fast, and brutal, across Kamari's face. The slap echoed in the tight space like a gunshot muffled by velvet. The boy's head snapped to the side. His sketchpad flew from his lap, fluttering down to the aisle in a broken scatter of pages. One loose drawing of a cartoon astronaut landed beneath the drink cart's wheel and crumpled. Kamari didn't make a sound. His mouth parted slightly. A tear welled in his right eye, not from pain alone but from disbelief, sharp and paralyzing. A pink welt bloomed on his cheek. Elijah dropped to his knees beside him, voice shaking, not from fear but fury barely held in check. "You hit him." Passengers nearby gasped. A man in 3D sat up straight, peering over the headrest. A flight crew member at the rear of the cabin stood motionless, stunned. The spell Vance had cast over the cabin with his fake smiles and authority had cracked. Vance stood there, shoulders high, jaw locked. No apology, no hint of remorse, just the cold confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. "He was being disruptive," he said flatly, adjusting the sleeves of his uniform. Kamari blinked, still silent, his fingers now lightly touching the swelling on his cheek. Terrell leaned across the row to steady him, one hand gripping his wrist, the other holding his shoulder. Elijah was still crouched, his body shielding Kamari from any further harm. No one moved, not yet. But something had shifted. From the corner of the cabin, a subtle vibration buzzed, Elijah's phone, screen lighting up with the time. He reached down, picked it up, then angled it just slightly. The camera app was open. The recording had already started. But for now, the boys said nothing more. The storm was still coming. The sky above them stretched on in silence, and the cabin hung heavy with unspoken truth. He was being disruptive. The back of Vance Heller's hand struck Kamari's cheek with a sharp crack that sliced through the murmuring cabin like a blade. Kamari gasped, not from the pain alone, but from the shock. His sketchpad tumbled from his lap, its pages fluttering like wounded wings down the narrow aisle. The overhead lights reflected off the glossy tray tables, but the glow did nothing to warm the cold silence that followed. Terrell froze. His fingers, which had been lightly drumming on the armrest moments earlier, curled into fists. Elijah's breath caught in his throat as his brain scrambled to process what he had just witnessed. No one moved. Not the elderly couple 2 rows up, not the suited businessman sipping a Bloody Mary across the aisle. Every face turned toward the 3 boys, and toward Vance, whose expression betrayed no regret, only irritation. "Sit." "Down," Vance growled, pointing a rigid finger at Elijah, who had instinctively half risen from his seat. "You hit him," Elijah whispered, his voice trembling, not from fear, but from disbelief. He knelt beside Kamari, brushing his brother's curly hair from his forehead, inspecting the swelling lip now forming beneath his nose. Kamari's eyes brimmed with tears, but he didn't let them fall. He held still, quiet and proud, just as their mother had taught them. Vance's smile was as tight as his jawline. "He was being disruptive," he said flatly, as if that explanation made everything permissible. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom above, announcing altitude and estimated arrival. Vance, seizing the moment, turned and walked briskly toward the cockpit, leaving behind a cabin heavy with tension. Inside the cockpit, Captain Harold Denton sat adjusting his instruments. His mind was on his daughter's science fair and whether he'd make it home in time. So when Vance slipped in and said, "We've got 3 teens in first class, loud, unruly, possibly under the influence," the words barely registered beyond protocol. "You want to move them?" the captain asked, not looking up from his panel. "Either that or restrain them," Vance replied. "It's escalating." Captain Denton sighed. He hated paperwork. "Do what you need to do. Keep it contained." Back in the cabin, an older black man named Curtis Jail shifted in his seat in 3C. He had seen it all. The slap, the juice bottle, the smirk. Curtis had known men like Vance all his life, men who wore uniforms not for service, but for control. He leaned across the aisle and tapped Elijah's arm gently. "Don't react," he whispered, his voice firm and low. "Document everything. Your father needs to see this." Elijah nodded, swallowing the heat rising in his chest. He pulled his phone from the seat pocket and quietly angled it toward Vance, who was now chatting with a fellow attendant near the galley, his gestures animated but casual, as if nothing had happened. Below, in the terminal, Reuben Thatch stepped off the jet bridge, finally allowed to board after an unexplained delay at the gate. He adjusted the cuff of his dark blazer, rolling his suitcase behind him, unaware of the storm already unfolding above. He entered the first-class cabin calmly, scanning for his sons. And then he saw them. Kamari was curled against the window, his hoodie damp, the fabric sticking slightly to his cheek. His lip had a shallow purple bruise. Terrell sat rigidly beside him, gripping his brother's hand with a stillness that betrayed a storm inside. Elijah didn't even glance up. His gaze was fixed, locked like steel on something Reuben couldn't see yet. Reuben's steps slowed. The ambient hum of the plane dulled in his ears. He felt something tighten in his chest, not panic, not yet, but the silent alarm only a father can hear. "What happened?" he asked slowly, his voice calm but cold. Vance turned at the sound. He plastered on a smile, the kind used to diffuse complaints and sidestep accountability. "Your sons were acting out, sir." "I handled it," he said, voice chipper, eyes narrowed. Reuben looked down at Kamari, his youngest, his dreamer, the one who always doodled spacecraft on napkins and whispered facts about stars at dinner. Then he looked back up, his jaw tightening. "No, Mr. Heller," Reuben said, every syllable deliberate. "You assaulted my child." Chaos unfurled the moment Reuben stepped back into his seat and locked eyes with his son's. Kamari's hoodie was still soaked, clinging to his small frame, his lip tinged with swelling. The boy sat rigid, not from shock anymore, but from something colder, humiliation. Elijah stared straight ahead, fists clenched on his knees. Terrell wouldn't let go of his younger brother's hand. None of them spoke, but their silence screamed louder than anything Reuben had ever heard in a boardroom. Reuben didn't blink. He didn't yell. He simply leaned toward Elijah and whispered, "Send the video to Mr. Pritchard." Now Elijah nodded and quickly unlocked his phone. His fingers trembled slightly, but his actions were sharp. The video had already been trimmed, the slap captured in brutal clarity, the sudden backhand, the stunned look on Kamari's face, the cold smirk on Vance's. Elijah hit send. A confirmation pinged. Within seconds, the recording was in the hands of Jerome Pritchard, Gravon Aerospace's chief legal strategist and one of the most feared litigation minds in the tech world. Elijah didn't know what would happen next, but Reuben did. Vance walked past their row again, his footsteps relaxed, almost leisurely as if nothing had happened. He didn't look at them. He didn't have to. The confidence in his stride was infuriating. Reuben's gaze followed him, dark and steady. In that moment, he wasn't a CEO. He was a father, and something inside him had changed. Kamari shifted in his seat and leaned into his father's side, voice soft as a breath. "Dad, he laughed when he hit me." The words cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal or failed contract ever had. Reuben's jaw tightened. He drew in a slow, deliberate breath, then exhaled through his nose. His mind was already calculating, not revenge, but justice. Above them, the cabin lights flickered slightly as the plane hit light turbulence. The seatbelt sign chimed on, but Reuben didn't move. He reached into the side of his carry-on and retrieved a slim, black device, his encrypted satellite phone, cleared for executive use. He connected the signal, waited 2 seconds, then dialed a private line. "Cullen," he said as soon as the line connected. "Sir," came the voice on the other end, crisp, alert. "This man doesn't get to land safely if my son was hit," Reuben said, each word clipped and precise. "Find me the air marshal on this flight, and give me his seat number." There was a pause, followed by rapid keystrokes. Cullen worked fast. "Copy. Scanning now. Aircraft ID matches Velum Skyways Flight 306A. Manifest confirms an assigned transit marshal, Darren Claiborne." Seated 5th floor, traveling under civilian cover, Reuben's eyes narrowed slightly. "Send him an encrypted ping. Tell him to expect me. Already done." He ended the call and slowly placed the device back into the bag, his fingers brushing over the nameplate on its side. Gravon 004 R. Thatch. Vance stood at the far end of the aisle now, leaning near the galley, sipping from a coffee cup. He was talking to another flight attendant, laughing softly, unaware that storm clouds were already forming behind him. Across the cabin, passengers were whispering. Some had seen what happened. Others only felt the shift in energy. Curtis Jail, the older man who had seen everything, sat quietly in his seat, tapping a note into his phone. Reuben saw him, and their eyes met for a brief second. Curtis gave a slight nod, silent confirmation, a shared truth. The aircraft hummed steadily through international airspace, its wings slicing the cold air miles above the earth. But inside, the temperature had changed. Reuben wasn't just preparing for legal war. He was preparing to remind the world that his sons were not to be broken. The captain's voice came over the intercom, casually announcing cruising altitude and expected time to arrival. Reuben tuned it out. He wasn't thinking about destination. He was thinking about confrontation. Because no matter what the captain said, this flight was not going to end as planned. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. The man who rose from seat 2D was not the grieving widower, not the soft-spoken engineer, not even the high-profile CEO that reporters wrote profiles on. He was Reuben Thatch, a father whose son had been slapped by a uniformed coward in full view of the world, and he would not let that moment pass like turbulence. He glanced at Elijah, then at Kamari. "I'll be right back," he said, and then, without another word, he began walking toward seat 5F. "Find me the air marshal on this flight and give me his seat number." The air inside the cabin tightened as Reuben Thatch approached row 5, his expression calm but his eyes sharp with quiet fury. Darren Claiborne, The plainclothes air marshal seated in 5F looked up from his magazine, sensing the shift immediately. His instincts told him this was not an ordinary passenger approaching. Reuben stopped at the aisle, leaned slightly closer, and said in a steady tone, "I know who you are." The words carried weight, not arrogance, but certainty. Darren lowered the magazine, his brow furrowing. He studied Reuben's face, recognizing the composure of a man used to high-stakes confrontations. After a brief silence, Darren responded in a low, firm voice. "What happened?" Without another word, Reuben extended his phone. Elijah's recording played in the dim cabin light, the crack of Vance's hand across Kamari's cheek, the stifled cry, the sharp accusations delivered with practiced cruelty. Darren's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, the muscles in his face betraying the anger he was trained to control. He shifted his posture, leaning forward slightly, shoulders squared, his voice dropping into a murmur filled with grim resolve. "That's more than enough," he muttered, as if speaking to himself. His hand brushed instinctively toward his concealed badge. "I'll handle it discreetly." Reuben's hand shot out, resting firmly on Darren's forearm. The gesture was not forceful, but it carried authority. Darren looked up, surprised at the interruption. Reuben's voice was calm, controlled, but layered with something deeper, an anger too disciplined to erupt, yet too powerful to be hidden. "No," Reuben said quietly. "Not discreetly. My son was humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers. He deserves the truth to be seen." The words hung in the air, pulling Darren into silence. He searched Reuben's face, weighing the request. Discretion was his instinct, his training, the path that avoided panic and kept passengers calm. But as he replayed the sound of the slap in his mind, as he remembered the boy's silence, Darren felt the weight of choice pressing on him. For the first time in years, he hesitated. Meanwhile, just a few rows ahead, Vance Heller moved down the aisle with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. His shoes clicked against the floor with deliberate rhythm, and his smirk flickered whenever he passed a passenger. He straightened his uniform vest as if the confrontation earlier had elevated his authority rather than exposed his cruelty. He glanced occasionally at the boys, his lips curling into the faintest grin, convinced their silence meant victory. To him, their father's absence during the ordeal had been proof that no one would stop him. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats as Vance walked by. Some avoided his gaze, unwilling to risk involvement. Others whispered quietly, their eyes darting between the boys and the attendant. The cabin had become a stage, and Vance performed with the confidence of someone who thought the audience powerless to act. Back in row 5, Darren exhaled slowly, weighing his next steps. He tapped the screen of the phone once more, replaying the video. The sound of Kamari's sketchpad hitting the aisle floor seemed louder the second time, echoing in his ears like a reminder of unfinished duty. Reuben withdrew the phone and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His movements were steady, but his eyes were sharp, watching Darren carefully as though measuring whether this man would rise to the moment or retreat into procedure. Darren finally nodded once, his decision sealed. He tucked the badge deeper into his jacket, but his hand lingered there, a silent promise of what was coming. He leaned toward Reuben, his voice low but steady. "All right. But if we do this your way, the entire cabin is going to see it. That means there's no turning back once it starts." Reuben's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening as his thoughts turned briefly to Kamari's trembling shoulders and Elijah's protective stance. "There's no turning back," he said. "Not for him, not for me, not anymore." Darren straightened in his seat, the decision now a course he could not undo. Around them, the hum of the engines masked the tension, but the air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Vance's footsteps echoed faintly as he returned toward the galley, head high, the smugness of unchecked power etched into every stride. Reuben's hand fell back to his side, but his presence lingered like a command in the air. Darren rose slowly, his face set in stone, and moved into the aisle, ready to confront the storm brewing only a few rows ahead. Meanwhile, Vance strutted down the aisle with the smugness of someone who had never been held accountable. But this time, his steps were numbered. "We need to divert," Darren Claiborne said firmly, his voice low but unwavering as he stood near the galley. He held the radio close to his mouth, his stance squared, gaze fixed straight ahead. A flicker of tension rippled through the cabin as the cockpit responded with skepticism. "Not without cause," the captain's voice crackled through. Darren didn't argue. He simply forwarded the video. Seconds passed, long, heavy seconds. The overhead lights hummed softly, a stark contrast to the hush that had settled over first class. Passengers glanced up from their seats, sensing something had shifted but not daring to ask what. At the front of the cabin, Vance Heller strutted down the aisle, adjusting his uniform like a man confident he still owned the room. Then came the tone. 3 short beeps over the intercom. The cockpit had made its decision. The plane was rerouting to Cadenport International. A subtle murmur passed between rows, quiet at first, then growing like a low tide. Passengers sat straighter, their eyes darting between Darren and the flight attendant now making his way back toward the jump seat with forced ease. Vance glanced around, noticing the stares, the silent judgment etched on every face. The tightness in his jaw betrayed his unease. Still, he forced a grin, tried to nod like nothing was wrong. But something was very wrong, and it was about to catch up with him. Curtis Jail rose slowly from seat 3D, tall and deliberate. His voice carried, not loud but firm, like someone who had waited his entire life to say the right thing at the right time. "You hit that boy," he said. "I saw it. So did the rest of us. And justice is finally catching up to you." The cabin fell still. Vance froze mid-step, shoulders stiff. Color rushed to his cheeks, then drained just as quickly. He turned to face Curtis, his mouth twitching. "You people always twist things," he muttered under his breath, the mask cracking. "Excuse me?" Curtis replied, brows raised. Before Vance could take another step, Darren moved. The air marshal stepped forward with precision, as if the entire plane had narrowed into a single hallway, a path that led directly to this moment. "Mr. Vance Heller," Darren said, his badge held firmly in one hand, the gold shield catching the cabin lights. "You are hereby relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight." Gasps fluttered across the rows. The tension broke like ice underfoot. Vance blinked, faltering for just a second. Then the sneer returned. "You can't do that," he barked, gesturing wildly. "I've served this airline for 17 years. Darren remained calm. He reached down, unlatched the small black case clipped discreetly to his belt, and opened it slowly. The metal glint of handcuffs shone inside, cold and final. "Try me." For a beat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Phones lifted into the air, discreet at first, then boldly. Several passengers angled their screens toward the confrontation, capturing every twitch in Vance's expression. Some whispered. Others just stared. Vance turned slowly, suddenly aware of the dozens of silent witnesses surrounding him. No one came to his defense. Not even the junior steward near the rear galley who now kept his eyes glued to the service card. Vance's voice dropped. "This is all wrong. You don't understand. These boys were—" "Sit," Darren interrupted, pointing to the jump seat near the galley wall. Vance hesitated, then looked around one last time, as if hoping someone, anyone, would come to his rescue. No one moved. Not a single voice spoke up in his favor. Even the captain remained silent over the intercom. With a visible tremble, Vance sat down, the cuffs clicking around his wrists a moment later. The sound echoed louder than the engines. Darren stepped back and surveyed the cabin. His tone changed, not softer, but reassuring. "This matter is now under investigation. Thank you for your cooperation. Please remain seated as we make our approach." He turned, nodded once toward Reuben Thatch, who returned it without a word, and walked back to the forward galley, standing watch like a sentinel. The cabin didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The silence itself was a verdict. The plane adjusted its course, and the clouds outside shifted as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the cabin in a dim, amber glow. In seat 2C, Kamari exhaled for the first time in minutes. Terrell reached over, gripping his brother's shoulder. Elijah sat upright, fists clenched on his knees, but the fire in his eyes had cooled into quiet resolve. And Vance? He sat alone now, hands restrained, eyes forward, jaw tight. He could feel every phone lens, every whispered breath, every ounce of justice finally turning its gaze toward him. The moment was no longer his to control. The cabin erupted in whispers and phones lifted to record. He thought humiliating black children mid-flight would go unanswered. But justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Vance sat restrained in the jump seat, his wrists chafing against the cuffs that Darren Claiborne had locked into place minutes ago. His jaw clenched, nostrils flared, and eyes darted across the cabin like a cornered animal. "You're all making a mistake," he spat, voice tight with disbelief and venom. His words didn't carry authority anymore. They fell flat, sour in the pressurized air, overshadowed by the weight of what had already unfolded. Across the aisle, the Thatch brothers sat in a quiet row of strength. Elijah, closest to the aisle, kept his eyes forward, shoulders stiff, fists resting tightly on his thighs. Terrell sat in the middle, protective, his arms still draped over Kamari's shoulder. Kamari, who had barely spoken since the slap, now sat upright, hoodie stained from earlier, his swollen lip a dull purple under the cabin lights. But something had shifted. His eyes, once trembling and searching, now stared straight ahead. He leaned closer to his father and whispered just loud enough for the others to hear. "Thank you, Dad." Reuben Thatch didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between father and son was louder than any applause. He nodded once, gently squeezing Kamari's hand, his thumb brushing over the boy's knuckles. It was a silent promise, one that said, "You are safe, you are not alone, and no one touches my sons without answering for it." Outside, the city lights of Cadenport glittered through the windows like broken glass. The cabin had descended into a tense stillness. A few passengers whispered softly, casting glances at Vance, who now looked smaller than ever, like a man trying to cling to authority that had already been stripped from him. His uniform still bore the airline's logo, but it no longer gave him power. It was just fabric now, empty, hollow. The landing gear whined beneath them, wheels lowering with a mechanical growl. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been directed to make a precautionary landing at Cadenport International. Please remain seated upon arrival. Ground authorities will be boarding shortly." Phones began to light up. Passengers exchanged knowing looks. Some had already posted blurry videos of Vance's confrontation. Others were rewatching the footage in disbelief. One man, a few rows back, muttered, "I hope that boy's okay." Another, clearly shaken, whispered to his travel companion, "That flight attendant's done." As the wheels screeched against the runway and the plane jolted slightly, Vance twisted against the cuffs and hissed at Darren. "This is ridiculous." "I was following protocol." Darren didn't look at him. He stood near the galley, arms crossed, eyes watching the forward cabin door as if daring anyone else to challenge him. "Protocol doesn't involve slapping minors," he replied coolly. The cabin rolled to a halt at a remote gate, far from the terminal's usual bustle. The engines powered down. The silence that followed was heavy. Moments later, a metallic click echoed as the jet bridge connected. The front door was unsealed with a hiss. Cool night air swept into the cabin, mingling with the tension like a storm front. Two Federal Transit officers in plain Navy uniforms stood just outside the open doorway, their postures rigid, expressions unreadable. They stepped in without ceremony, walking straight toward the jump seat. One officer, tall with gray at his temples, looked at Darren, then down at the restrained flight attendant. "This the man?" he asked. Darren nodded. "Name's Vance Heller. Assaulted a minor mid-flight. Evidence is already in circulation." Vance's face flushed red. "You can't arrest me." "I was doing my job, those kids were." "Save it," the officer said sharply, cutting him off. "Stand up." "I can't. I'm cuffed," Vance snapped, voice brittle. The other officer leaned in. "We'll help." With a swift, practiced motion, they hauled him to his feet. He staggered slightly, caught off guard by the lack of ceremony. Passengers watched in hushed awe as the once confident crew member was marched down the aisle he had once ruled with intimidation. Curtis Jail, still seated in the last row of first class, folded his arms and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Accountability has a long memory." The cameras caught everything. The Thatch boys didn't move. Kamari stared at the floor as Vance passed. Elijah met his gaze, calm, unwavering. Terrell didn't flinch. Vance didn't speak another word. At the threshold of the jet bridge, the media waited, tipped off by Graven Aerospace's rapid response team. Flashes erupted the moment Vance's figure appeared in the doorway. The officers didn't pause. They marched him down the ramp and into a waiting black vehicle. Back inside the plane, Reuben exhaled slowly, as if releasing the last of the poison. One of the flight crew, visibly shaken, approached him timidly. "Mr. Thatch, the airline would like to extend its deepest regrets." Reuben held up a hand. His voice was level but cold as polished steel. "You'll talk to my lawyers." The crew member nodded silently and backed away. Reuben turned to his sons. "Let's go home." And just like that, the plane's tension broke, not into relief, but into resolve. "You'll talk to my lawyers," he told them. The news broke before the sun had fully risen. Vance Heller's termination was confirmed in a brief, sterile statement from Vellum Skyways. Effective immediately, Mr. Vance Heller is no longer employed with our airline. The release contained no mention of the incident, no apology, no recognition of wrongdoing. Just a cold dismissal, clinical, quiet, and calculated. But Reuben Thatch wasn't interested in silence. By the time the press got hold of the story, Gravon Aerospace's legal division had already filed a civil suit naming both Vance Heller and Vellum Skyways as defendants. The charges were grave: physical assault against a minor, emotional trauma, negligence in supervision, and institutional bias. Reuben had made one thing clear: he didn't want a firing. He wanted answers. He wanted the truth dragged into daylight, stripped of spin and buried memos. Inside Gravon's private conference room, high above the city skyline, Reuben sat with Mr. Pritchard and his litigation team. The room was dim, lit mostly by the flickering screens of devices streaming news coverage. Kamari's swollen lip, frozen mid-slump on a paused video still, hovered on the main monitor like a wound that refused to heal. "He's going to say it was a one-time mistake," Pritchard murmured, adjusting his glasses. "They always do." "Then we make sure the world sees the pattern," Reuben replied, voice steady, low. He didn't look up. His eyes stayed on the screen. That pattern came to light faster than anyone expected. Just hours after the video went viral, anonymous reports began to flood in. Former flight attendants, baggage handlers, even a co-pilot, all men, all willing to speak now that someone had forced the door open. Their voices were raw and filled with regret. One report came from a man named Gerald Rankin, who described a near-identical incident from a year prior: a young black teen accused of faking illness during turbulence, publicly berated by Vance and threatened with arrest. That case had been quietly resolved. The boy's parents offered free tickets and a settlement, so hush-hush it never even reached HR. But this time, Reuben refused to let it stay buried. Across the Thatch household, the atmosphere was subdued but electric. Elijah kept pacing by the window, phone in hand, checking updates. Tyrell sat on the living room floor, headphones off, unusually quiet. Kamari, the softest of the three, remained bundled in a thick blanket, sketchpad in lap, pencil still. He wasn't drawing. Not yet. Reuben entered, carrying 3 mugs of warm cocoa. No coffee, no edge, just comfort. He handed each son a cup without a word. Then he sat beside Kamari, wrapping an arm gently across his shoulder. Kamari leaned in, but didn't speak. It was Tyrell who broke the silence. "Are they going to say we made it up?" he asked, eyes trained on the muted TV screen where pundits debated airline accountability. Reuben took a slow breath. "They might try." "But you're fighting it?" Elijah asked, standing straighter now. "I'm not just fighting it," Reuben said. "I'm burning the rot out from its roots." A beat passed. Then Tyrell whispered, "I won't forget how you stood between us and that man." Reuben's gaze softened, but his spine stayed straight. That's what fathers do. The next morning, Reuben stood at the podium of a press conference. No podium logos, no staged backdrops. Just a microphone, a camera, and his presence. "This isn't about wealth," he began, "or status, or being a CEO. This is about what was stolen from my son on that flight. His safety, his dignity, his humanity. And we will not be silent." Reporters leaned in. Cameras zoomed. He continued, "Some say the skies are neutral. But when neutrality shelters abuse, it becomes a weapon. I am here to remind them, and to remind you, that silence is no longer protection. It is permission." By the time he stepped away, his speech had already gone viral. Within hours, new hashtags trended. Other passengers from that flight confirmed the events. A few even sent in their own cell phone footage, showing different angles, capturing Vance's smirk as he slapped Kamari, the stunned reactions from nearby passengers, the quiet fear in the boy's posture. Meanwhile, behind the glass walls of Vellum's corporate offices, panic set in. Boardroom meetings turned frantic. Legal consultants were flown in. PR firms scrambled to reshape the narrative. But it was too late. Reuben had already taken control of the story, not through anger, but through facts, resolve, and an unshakable presence as a father who refused to back down. The airline issued another statement, longer, this time with vague acknowledgments of prior conduct concerns and a commitment to improving internal accountability measures. Reuben read the statement on his tablet, standing by the window of his office. He gave a small, joyless smile and handed the device back to Pritchard. "They still think this ends with a memo," he said. "They'll learn," Pritchard replied. From the balcony, the city stretched out under evening light, busy, unbothered, unaware that a war had begun in the air, and one father's fury was just lifting off. Back home, Kamari finally opened his sketch pad. On the first page, he drew a cabin aisle, 3 brothers seated together. A shadowy figure hovered in the foreground, but this time, a taller figure stood between them, arms wide, firm like steel, blocking the shadow's path. Kamari's pencil paused. Then he added one final detail, a caption beneath the image. "The skies may be neutral, but justice flies with those who refuse to be silent." The courtroom fell silent the moment the video began playing. There was no music, no dramatic cue, just the tinny sound of the cabin's ambient noise and the tremble in Elijah's breath as he held the phone steady. The footage showed Kamari sitting in his seat, fidgeting nervously before Vance Heller's hand came down with a sharp, unmistakable crack. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. The judge, a middle-aged man with graying temples and a stern gaze, leaned forward slightly in his chair, his fingers pressing together as if bracing himself. Reuben sat beside his attorney, Mr. Pritchard, jaw locked, eyes unmoving. His sons were in the second row of the gallery, all 3 dressed in quiet navy suits, their matching green lapel pins a subtle tribute to their mother's favorite color. Kamari sat in the middle, shoulders tense, eyes low, but he kept glancing toward his father with silent questions. "Can I do this? Will they believe me?" Reuben gave the smallest nod. Just once. It was enough. Across the aisle, the airline's legal team, 4 men in polished gray suits, shuffled papers in stiff silence. They had tried to bury this, tried to keep it quiet with a quick settlement and polite statements, but Reuben had refused. "You allowed this man to fly for years," he had told their lead counsel in private mediation, his voice cold and steady. "You'll answer publicly." Now they were. Mr. Pritchard stood as the footage ended and addressed the court. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm but commanding, "what you've just witnessed is not isolated. It is the symptom of a culture that was warned more than once and did nothing." He gestured to the stack of affidavits and written complaints behind him. 7 prior reports, 7, all buried under bureaucracy and silence. The judge shifted his attention to the defense table. "Mr. Grell," he said to the airline's lead counsel, "is your client denying this footage is authentic?" Grell stood, buttoning his jacket. "We are not denying the video, Your Honor. But we argue this was an unfortunate lapse in judgment by a single employee." "Is that what you're calling it?" Reuben muttered under his breath, loud enough to be heard by the first few rows. Grell hesitated. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Continue, Mr. Grell." Grell cleared his throat. "This employee no longer works for Vellum Skyways. We have taken swift action, and we believe further litigation is unnecessary." Mr. Pritchard stepped forward, calm but stern. "Then explain why Vellum never disciplined this employee before this incident, or why every prior complaint was marked as resolved without investigation." The defense flinched. Reuben's eyes moved to the jury, 12 men of varied backgrounds. Some were visibly affected by the video. One of them, a school principal from North Avonshire, had pressed his lips into a thin line. Another, a logistics manager and father of 2, nodded slowly, as if he'd seen enough. The bailiff called the next witness. "Kamari Thatch." Kamari stood slowly. His shoes squeaked faintly against the wood floor. He walked past his father and brothers, past Mr. Pritchard, and took his seat at the witness stand. A microphone was adjusted toward him, but his voice, at first, was too low. "Speak up, son," the judge said gently. Kamari swallowed, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. "I was just sitting," he began, and he told Tyrell to take off his hoodie. We didn't understand why. Other people still had theirs on." He paused, searching the room for reassurance. Elijah nodded once from the gallery. Kamari looked down at his hands. He grabbed Tyrell's arm. Elijah stood up. Vance told us to sit down. A long breath. And then, he hit me. Mr. Pritchard approached the stand carefully, like a teacher trying not to spook a skittish student. "Kamari," he said softly, Did you say anything to provoke Mr. Heller? Kamari shook his head. No, sir. I was just laughing at a comic. Did you feel unsafe? There was a pause. The courtroom leaned forward collectively. I just wanted to feel safe flying with my dad. That sentence lingered in the air like smoke. The courtroom was utterly still. Even Grell lowered his eyes. The judge, after a moment, tapped his gavel softly, not out of order, but perhaps to ground the room again. Kamari was dismissed from the stand. He walked back to the gallery slowly. Reuben stood and met him halfway, placing a steady hand on his son's shoulder. No words were spoken between them. None were needed. As court adjourned for the day, reporters outside scrambled to capture the story. Inside, Mr. Pritchard gathered his files. They'll try to pivot, he said to Reuben. They'll say the video was taken out of context. That Kamari misremembered. We need to be ready, Reuben nodded. Then let's bring context. Let's bring everything. There was more to come, sealed complaints, internal documents, and a former HR officer willing to testify anonymously. But for now, they had the public's attention. They had the court's silence. And they had the truth. And when Kamari turned to his father that evening, voice quiet but firm, he asked, Was that enough? Reuben looked at him, proud and composed. We're just getting started. I just wanted to feel safe flying with my dad. The courtroom was silent. A sealed manila envelope arrived at Reuben's legal office on a gray morning, unmarked except for the initials RT scrawled on the back in thick black ink. It was Elijah who noticed it first, handed off by a courier who left without a word. Reuben, deep in conference with Mr. Pritchard and his litigation team, opened it without fanfare, expecting perhaps another letter of support, another press clipping, another offer to settle. What spilled out instead sent a chill through the room. Inside were printed HR files, copies of formal complaints, each stamped with the Vellum Skyways insignia. Reuben scanned the top page, his breath tightening as he read the date. March 3rd, 2022. The words blurred for a moment as his eyes caught on the complaint title, Verbal Harassment and Targeted Mistreatment by Flight Attendant Vance Heller. Attached were 6 more, each with different names, different flight numbers, but the same accused. Some detailed racial slurs. Others described physical intimidation. One even mentioned a 9-year-old passenger being reduced to tears. None of the documents showed any record of disciplinary action, only internal memos stamped resolved, often within 24 hours. Pritchard stood slowly, mouth parted in disbelief. These were buried, never escalated beyond department leads. He flipped through page after page, his fingers trembling with controlled fury. This is a pattern. They knew, and they did nothing. Reuben's voice was low, dangerous. Then it's time everyone else knew too. Within an hour, Pritchard had filed for an emergency subpoena to make the documents admissible in court. A trusted media contact from the Continental Tribune was looped in, and by sunset, the story was out. The headline hit like a thunderclap. Airline knew about Vance Heller, for years, did nothing. The fallout was immediate. Major news networks flashed photos of Kamari's swollen face next to the line. Victim number 7, or number 17. Cable anchors debated corporate complicity, and talking heads analyzed every leaked page. Screens replayed Elijah's recording alongside bullet points from each complaint. By nightfall, hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag justice at 30,000 feet. Hashtag ground vellum now. Reuben watched from his office window as the street below swarmed with reporters. Inside, his son sat quietly on the couch, Terrell with his knees tucked to his chest, Kamari sketching absent-mindedly, Elijah scanning Twitter on his phone. There was no celebration, only silence. We didn't want this to be about vengeance, Reuben said softly, still looking out at the cameras, but silence would have let it happen again. Maybe already as Terrell looked up. So, what now? Reuben turned. His expression was carved from steel. We aim higher. The next morning, Reuben's legal team publicly expanded the case, not just against Vance, but now formally against Vellum Skyways, for gross negligence, willful cover-up, and endangerment of minors. Reuben didn't stop there. He stepped onto the courthouse steps, camera lights flickering like a thunderstorm behind him. No company that flies across our skies should be allowed to sweep abuse under a rug lined with profit margins, he declared. We're not just seeking compensation. We're seeking transformation. He listed demands. A passenger rights charter, legally binding for all domestic and international flights. Mandatory annual sensitivity training for all flight personnel. And most controversially, a whistleblower protection protocol for crew and passengers alike with federal oversight. Inside Vellum's corporate tower, panic brewed. Meetings were called. PR firms were summoned. Board members who had first thought Rubin's case would quietly fade now scrambled as the airline's stock plummeted 18% in 2 days. Investors wanted answers. Lawmakers started to ask questions. Vellum's CEO, Gideon Markell, issued a brief statement. We are conducting a thorough internal investigation and will cooperate fully with the court. But the public wasn't buying it. Then the unthinkable happened. Darian Locke, the airline's vice president of crew operations, stood before reporters with shaking hands and an unflinching voice. I was part of the team that buried those complaints, he said plainly. We were told it was better to contain than confront. But I'm done protecting a culture that punishes silence and rewards indifference. The room erupted in noise. Locke placed his company badge on the podium and walked away without taking questions. Rubin watched the footage in his office. The boys sat beside him again. Kamari whispered, Does this mean they're listening now? Rubin didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped gently against the armrest, eyes fixed on the screen. Finally, he spoke. They're not just listening, he said. They're learning who we are. He paused, glancing over at the envelope now framed on the wall behind him, the first proof that truth still finds a way to rise. Then he turned to Kamari and placed a hand on his shoulder, the weight of the moment not lost on either of them. And then he said, with the quiet finality of someone who had crossed a storm and was now steering others through it. But Rubin wasn't after money, he was after reform. He demanded that Vellum implement a passenger rights charter, mandatory sensitivity training, and a whistleblower protection system for both crew and passengers. At first, the airline resisted. Then, one of their own executives, Darian Locke, publicly sided with Rubin and resigned in protest. The gavel struck once, sharp and commanding. All rise, the bailiff called out, his voice echoing off the polished wood panels of courtroom 6B. Reuben Thatch stood slowly, adjusting the lapels of his navy blue suit with deliberate calm. To his right, Elijah, Kamari, and Tyrell stood together, no longer just 3 boys in matching hoodies, but 3 young men carrying the weight of public scrutiny and private pain. The gallery behind them was full. Journalists scribbled notes. Cameras from news outlets, barred from video but allowed to capture still images, clicked quietly like a swarm of mechanical insects. Judge Orman Yates entered, a stoic man with deep furrows etched into his brow. His presence silenced the room. This was the second and final day of the hearing that had already sent ripples through the national conversation on race, authority, and aviation policy. Rubin stepped forward as the judge gave a slight nod. You may proceed with your closing statement, Mr. Thatch. Rubin took a deep breath, not to calm his nerves, but to center his purpose. The courtroom, for a moment, seemed to fade. All he could see were his sons. Kamari's bruised face from that day, Tyrell's shaken voice, Elijah's trembling hands. They were the reason he was here, not as a CEO, not as a strategist, but as a father. He turned to face the judge, the jury, and the crowded room. His voice, when it came, was steady but full of heat. My sons, Rubin began, his eyes holding firm, are not problems. They are not threats. They are young men. They are brothers. They are brilliant. He paused, allowing the weight of each word to land. And no man in a uniform gets to decide otherwise just because of how they look. A murmur swept through the gallery, subdued but full of feeling. Even the court reporter, typing diligently, stole a glance at the boys seated behind him. Rubin didn't need to say more. The footage had been shown. The testimonies had been heard. Vance Heller's defense had unraveled under cross-examination, particularly when confronted with internal documents that revealed his long history of complaints and the company's failure to discipline him. Judge Yates leaned forward slightly. Thank you, Mr. Thatch. The court will now recess for deliberation. As the judge exited and the courtroom emptied, Rubin sat with his sons in quiet reflection. Kamari clutched his father's hand, Elijah kept his eyes on the floor, and Terrell, usually the quietest, whispered, "Do you think they'll actually see us, Dad?" "Like really see us?" Reuben looked at him, his voice soft but certain. "They have no choice now." 2 hours passed, then 3. When the doors reopened, the judge's return was met with a silence so complete it felt like the room had forgotten how to breathe. Judge Yates cleared his throat and read from the decision. In the matter of Reuben Thatch versus Vellum Skyways and Vance Heller, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff. A single gasp came from the back row. The judge continued, his tone even but resolute. The airline is hereby ordered to pay punitive damages to the Thatch family. Additionally, a court-mandated oversight board shall be installed at Vellum Skyways within 90 days. Mr. Reuben Thatch is formally invited to chair that board. Furthermore, the defendant, Mr. Vance Heller, is sentenced to 18 months of probation, 400 hours of public service, and is permanently banned from employment in any airline or airport capacity. Reuben didn't move. Not yet. His sons leaned in. Kamari's eyes widened. Terrell blinked in disbelief, and Elijah's lips parted like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. The gavel struck again. "This court is adjourned." Only then did Reuben let out the breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His legal advisor, Mr. Pritchard, leaned over and offered a firm handshake. "It's done." But it's only the beginning. The hallway outside the courtroom was flooded with reporters, supporters, and activists holding signs. Some read "Justice Flies Now," others bore Kamari's sketch from the viral video, the one where he had drawn a superhero version of himself with wings. But Reuben didn't stop for the cameras. He led his sons to a side exit where a black SUV waited to take them home. As they passed through the security turnstiles, Kamari stopped. A poster had been placed on the wall beside the gate. It was new, bold red and gold letters stamped over a clean white background. "Respect flies here." Kamari's eyes lit up. He tapped Reuben on the arm and pointed to it. "That's ours, isn't it?" Reuben looked up at the sign, then down at his son's face, no longer swollen, no longer silenced. He placed a hand gently on Kamari's shoulder and nodded once. "It is now." The wheels of the private jet kissed the tarmac with a soft jolt as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the runway at Crescent Bay Airfield. Inside the sleek, whisper-quiet cabin, the Thatch family sat together, finally airborne again, not because they had to be, but because they chose to be. Reuben sat beside the wide window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. No security alerts, no public stares, no nervous glances from strangers, just the quiet hum of an aircraft he had personally vetted. Across from him, Elijah cradled a thick, glossy book in his lap, the freshly published volume of Skybound, his comic series inspired by the ordeal they had endured. The cover depicted 3 dark-skinned brothers standing confidently on a mountaintop, capes billowing in the wind, with a stylized jet in the clouds behind them. He held it like it was made of glass. Tyrell leaned forward, reviewing diagrams on a tablet, blueprints for propulsion systems he was studying as part of his new training program. His fingers moved with precision, tracing engine chambers and fuel routes with the quiet obsession of someone who had found his path. He still wore the same dark green hoodie from that fateful flight, but now he'd sewn a patch on the sleeve, a stylized phoenix bursting from an airline seat. Kamari, seated closest to Reuben, peered out the window. His voice was soft, but steady. "Dad, remember what I told you after the hearing?" Reuben looked at him, his expression warm but expectant. "I said I'd speak up next time," Kamari continued, turning. "I meant it. I've been talking to some kids at school who feel scared to travel. Some won't even get on planes anymore." Reuben's eyes didn't flinch. "And what did you tell them?" Kamari straightened, his voice gaining weight. "That we don't have to stay quiet. That people will listen if we speak the truth. Like you did." A silence settled, but it wasn't empty. It was full of pride, of pain, of growth. The cabin door opened and a tall, sharply dressed attendant named Marcus, a trusted Gravon Aerospace employee, entered with bottled water. He paused at the edge of the conversation but said nothing, simply placing the tray down and nodding respectfully. The contrast between this gentle professionalism and what they had experienced on Vellum Skyways months before didn't go unnoticed. Reuben took the bottle but didn't open it. His mind had already moved ahead. He glanced at the sleek screen on the sidewall, his itinerary for tomorrow's appearance at the International Transit Conference. A bold red banner read, "Keynote, Reuben Thatch, Restoring Trust at 30,000 feet." He exhaled through his nose and tapped the screen off. "This isn't just about us anymore," he said quietly. "It never was." The next morning, in the heart of the Arcadia Convention Center, Reuben stepped onto the stage to a packed hall of journalists, tech innovators, and global aviation leaders. His suit was dark charcoal, his tie the same deep green as his son's hoodies. The moment he gripped the podium, the murmurs hushed. Cameras blinked, pens stilled. He didn't start with statistics. He didn't begin with policies. "My sons," he said, voice firm, clear, unshaking, "are not problems. They are not threats. They are brothers. They are brilliant. They belong in every seat they choose to sit in, first class or otherwise, and no man in a uniform has the right to decide otherwise." A beat of silence followed. Then thunderous applause erupted. Behind the stage, Kamari watched from the wings with Terrell and Elijah. Elijah was holding his comic book tightly. Terrell had one hand on his brother's shoulder. Kamari's eyes never left the stage. Reuben continued, detailing the oversight reforms he'd helped push through, not just at Velum Skyways but now adopted by 5 major airlines. Policies that required real-time accountability, body cam audits for high-risk crew, and whistleblower protections that couldn't be buried. He explained how Gravon had funded a task force that trained both passengers and staff on civil transit rights, and he ended not with anger, but with invitation. "We didn't ask for this fight," Reuben said, his voice now rising, resonating, "but we answered it. For every child who ever felt small at 30,000 feet, this story is proof that your voice can still rise higher." He paused, looking directly at his son standing in the shadows of the wings, and smiled. "And in this family, we fly together." Moments later, the truth hit. Their father was a powerful CEO, and the same cruelty turned into consequences. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It portrays themes of racism, abuse of authority, and the emotional trauma inflicted on Black children through targeted mistreatment. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic bias, provoke reflection on accountability, and inspire empathy, justice, and protection for the vulnerable.